Welcome to Narrative Nights. Step into a world of mystery, intrigue, and suspense. At Narrative Nights, we bring you thrilling detective stories that will challenge your mind and keep you guessing until the very end. Before we begin, we'd love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop a comment and let us know which part of the globe you're watching from. We're all united by the love of a good mystery. Let the investigation begin.
Murder at Ashford Manor. Chapter 1. The Wedding at Ashford Manor. That evening, Ashford Manor wore its splendor like a bridal veil. Moonlight, crisp and silver, washed over the manicured lawns and spilled through the tall drawing-room windows, where it was caught and multiplied 1,000 times by the magnificent chandeliers suspended from the ornate ceiling. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies and tuberoses, their fragrance a sweet, almost funereal counterpoint to the celebratory hum of conversation. It was, as everyone agreed, the grandest wedding the district had seen in a generation. Mr. Richard's daughter, Martha, was marrying into the formidable family of Ashford Manor itself. From a well-chosen but unobtrusive chair in a corner, Miss Jane Marple observed the proceedings with her customary quiet attention. She was a guest of the groom's side, a distant connection, invited more out of familial duty than expectation. Wrapped in her familiar, soft grey shawl, with her knitting bag and a small diary resting by her side, she presented a study in serene composure. Her gaze, however, missed nothing. It drifted from the silken gowns and lustrous pearls of the women to the starched fronts and polished shoes of the men, taking in the smiles, the laughter, and the subtle, unspoken currents that flowed beneath the surface of such gatherings. Her eye settled on the matriarch, Sophia. Enthroned in a high-backed damask chair, she was the undisputed center of this glittering universe. Well past 50, she carried herself with an authority that had not been diminished by age, but rather honed by it. A simple string of pearls graced her neck, and a light silk scarf was draped artfully across her shoulders. Tonight, her elder great-grandson was married, and her sharp eyes shone with a profound, almost possessive, contentment. Near the entrance, her son, Thomas, and his wife, Clara, performed their duties as hosts. Thomas's smile seemed a little fixed, the warmth not quite reaching his eyes. Clara, by contrast, was a flutter of nervous energy, her laughter a shade too bright, her gestures a little too effusive. Their elder son, Michael, the groom, stood beside his radiant bride, Martha. They were a perfect couple, their faces alight with a joy so pure it seemed almost fragile. Miss Marple's gaze travelled further, to the younger generation. Harry, Michael's brother of 18 years, circulated through the crowd with a cheerfulness that seemed almost feverish, his laughter erupting at odd moments. His 16-year-old sister, Emily, stood near him, a shy, quiet figure who would occasionally hide a smile behind her hand. An innocent, one would think, yet her stillness was of a watchful kind. Everything, Miss Marple reflected, was precisely as it should be. The orchestra's melody wove gracefully through the pleasantries, waiters moved like ghosts with trays of champagne and delicacies, and the brilliance of the chandeliers cast a benevolent glow upon it all. One felt that Sophia herself had orchestrated not just the evening, but the very happiness of its participants. Leaning back slightly in her chair, the matriarch surveyed the scene, her domain, and gave a long, slow sigh of deep satisfaction. And then, in a heartbeat, the perfection shattered. The chandeliers gave a violent quiver. The lights flickered, dimmed to a sickly orange, and then surged back to life. A few guests laughed, others exchanged questioning glances. But in the next instant, with a collective, soft pop, every light in the great room was extinguished. The manor was plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. It could not have lasted for more than a minute or two, but it felt like an eternity. A wave of disorientation swept the room. A woman gave a short, nervous scream. There was the sound of someone stumbling against a table, followed by the sharp clatter of a silver tray and the smash of glass. Children began to cry. A voice called out, "Stay calm, everyone," but it was thin and frayed with its own panic. Then, as suddenly as it had vanished, the light returned. The chandeliers blazed forth, illuminating a scene of frozen, silent horror. Sophia was no longer sitting upright. She had slumped grotesquely in her chair, her head lolled to one side at an unnatural angle. A dark, ruinous gash had been drawn across her throat. Around her mouth was a faint bruising, a shadowy imprint, as if a hand had been pressed there with brutal force to stifle a final, desperate cry. For a moment, the tableau held. The orchestra was silent. The guests were statues. Then a woman's shriek, high and piercing, tore through the stillness. "Oh, my God! Sophia!" Thomas was the first to move, stumbling forward and shaking his mother's shoulder, but she was a dead weight, utterly lifeless. Clara hid her face in her hands, her shoulders racked with shuddering sobs. Michael and Martha stared at one another, their wedding smiles erased, their faces blank masks of disbelief. Harry's face had turned a waxy, ashen grey, while Emily, her eyes wide with terror, clutched at his arm. Miss Marple remained seated. The familiar gravity that settled on her features when faced with the darker truths of human nature was now firmly in place. Without rising, she pulled her soft shawl a little closer around her shoulders, less against a physical chill than against the profound cold that had just invaded the room. The night had changed its color. The joyous celebration had curdled into a wake. Someone had the presence of mind to summon the police. Within what felt like minutes, though it was surely longer, the sounds of authority arrived. Constables secured the manor doors, their sober announcement cutting through the panicked murmurs, "No one is to leave the premises. The house is under police investigation." Inspector Graves entered the hall like a blast of cold, northern wind. He was a stern, solid man well known in the district, and his face was a thundercloud of grim purpose. His sharp eyes swept over the glittering, horrified assembly, missing nothing. "This celebration," he declared, his voice deep and resonant, "is now the scene of a murder. The person responsible for this act is in this room. And I assure you, they will not be leaving." A fresh wave of fear rippled through the guests. They looked from one to another, the bonhomie of an hour ago replaced by a chilling suspicion. Who, in this room of smiles and silk, was a killer? Miss Marple sat quietly, her gaze moving from one family member to the next. She saw Harry, twisting his fingers in a knot of nervous energy. She saw Emily's eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She noted the tight, anxious set of Clara's jaw and the glint of raw, helpless anger in Thomas's eyes. The chandeliers of Ashford Manor still glowed brightly, but their light now seemed to mock the assembly, casting a pale, accusatory shadow upon the house. A wedding that was to be the beginning of a story of joy had become, instead, the final, brutal chapter in another story entirely. Chapter 2: The First Questions. Inspector Graves's presence imposed a new and rigid order upon the chaos. His constables moved with a quiet efficiency that was almost as unnerving as the preceding horror, their heavy boots echoing on the polished parquet floor. The glittering assembly of wedding guests, who only an hour before had mingled with such easy grace, now stood in stiff, isolated groups, their finery looking garish and absurd in the grim new reality. Fear, cold and palpable, had replaced the scent of flowers. Sophia's body still lay where she had fallen, now covered by a hastily procured tablecloth, a stark white island in a sea of vibrant color. In her corner chair, Miss Marple sat quite still, one hand resting near her knitting bag. Her expression was placid, but her eyes, missing no detail, moved from one pale face to the next, observing, cataloguing, and understanding. Inspector Graves established a makeshift headquarters at a small writing desk in the alcove. He opened a notebook, its clean pages a stark contrast to the evening's messy conclusion. "I will need to speak with the immediate family first," he announced, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Mr. Thomas, if you please." Thomas, his face the color of putty, approached the desk. His earlier anger had subsided into a heavy, weary shock. "Sir," the inspector began, his tone professionally level, "can you tell me where you were when the lights went out?" Thomas let out a long, ragged breath. "On the lawn. Just outside the French doors. My wife, Clara, was with me. We were speaking with some of the cousins. We heard a scream from inside just after the lights failed. We ran back in." His voice was flat, mechanical, the voice of a man reciting a truth too dreadful to be fully comprehended. Graves made a neat, precise note. "Thank you, sir. That will be all for now." He did not look up as Thomas retreated, but instead called his next name. "Harry." The young man of 18 approached with a composure that was, in its own way, more jarring than his father's overt distress. He stood straight, his hands loosely at his sides. "I was in the kitchen," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I had gone to speak with the cook about the savories for later. I was there when the power failed." The inspector looked up, his gaze sharp and penetrating. "You didn't hear a commotion from this room?" "The kitchen doors are thick, Inspector." "We heard a distant shout, perhaps, but assumed someone had stumbled in the dark." "Nothing more." Harry's tone was so direct, so straightforward, that it seemed unimpeachable. Miss Marple, however, noted that it was the sort of directness a clever schoolboy might use when trying to appear truthful. Next came the newlyweds. Michael, his face pale and drawn, kept a protective arm around his bride. They approached the desk together, a small, united front against the encroaching nightmare. "And you, sir?" Graves asked, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "We were in the rose garden," Michael answered, his voice barely a whisper. "Just for a moment. To be alone. We saw the house go dark from there." Martha nodded, clinging to his arm, her white wedding dress now seeming like a shroud. Emily was last. The 16-year-old girl, still trembling, spoke so hesitantly her words were almost lost. I was in the garden, too. By the fountain." The inspector's pen scratched methodically across the paper. He closed his notebook with a decisive snap and rose to his feet, surveying the anxious faces turned towards him. "It seems clear enough," he stated, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. This was the work of an intruder. The doors were open for the wedding, the grounds were full of people coming and going. Some thief, seeing his chance, slipped inside during the confusion. He was likely trying to steal Mrs. Sophia's pearls, was disturbed when she cried out and silenced her. In the ensuing darkness, he made his escape. A collective, audible sigh of relief passed through the room. The guests nodded quickly, eagerly. The thought of a faceless stranger, a common burglar, was infinitely preferable to the monstrous alternative that the killer was one of them, still breathing the same terrified air. It was then that a soft, rather apologetic voice broke the silence. "Inspector, if you would forgive me for saying so." Inspector Graves turned, his expression one of pure irritation. He saw a gentle, elderly lady in a grey shawl looking at him with mild, intelligent blue eyes. "And you are?" he asked curtly. "My name is Jane Marple. I am merely a guest. But a small point has occurred to me." Her voice, though quiet, was perfectly clear and held a peculiar firmness. "The darkness, you see, lasted for a very short time. No more than 2 minutes, I should think. For an outsider, a stranger, to find his way through this crowded room in the pitch black, to locate one specific person, to deliver such a deliberate blow, and then to slip away entirely unseen, it does seem a little unlikely, does it not? One feels he would have needed to know the layout of the room rather well." The inspector's eyebrows shot up. He swallowed the sharp retort that had risen to his lips. There was an undeniable, if infuriating, logic to the old woman's words. "What exactly are you suggesting, madam?" Miss Marple adjusted her shawl. "I am not suggesting anything, Inspector," she replied, with a quiet certainty that sent a fresh chill through the room. "I am merely observing that this was not the clumsy act of a startled thief. It was swift, precise, and purposeful. It has the feel of something premeditated." And if that is the case, her gaze swept gently over the silent, watching faces of the family, then one must conclude that the killer is not some stranger who fled into the night. The killer is still here, among us. Her words dropped into the icy silence like stones into a frozen pond. The relief that had flooded the room moments before vanished, replaced by a suspicion that was 1,000 times more dreadful. Glances that had been fearful were now sharp, accusatory. Inspector Graves stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the unassuming old lady. His face remained stern, but he knew, with a sinking feeling, that her quiet observation could not be dismissed. He turned to his constable with a new sharpness in his voice. "Have the body sent for a full post-mortem at once," he commanded. He then looked back at Miss Marple. "Very well, madam. If things are as you say, then this will require a much, much deeper investigation." The guests of Ashford Manor had just realized they were no longer guests at a wedding. They were witnesses, keepers of secrets, and, until proven otherwise, suspects in a murder. Chapter 3: The Murmurs of St. Mary Mead. The morning after the tragedy at Ashford Manor, St. Mary Mead awoke to its usual, unhurried rhythm. A gentle sun filtered through the climbing roses that framed Miss Marple's leaded windows, casting dappled light upon the chintz armchair where she sat today. The distant, reassuring clatter of the milk float on the lane and the cheerful chirping of sparrows in the thatch were sounds as familiar and comforting as the steady click of her own knitting needles. Yet, for Miss Marple, the peaceful tableau was a fragile veneer. Her mind was not on the intricate lace pattern taking shape in her hands, but on the chilling disarray of the previous night, the sudden, plunging darkness, the single, stifled cry she was almost certain she had heard, and the dreadful, still image of Sophia, her life extinguished amidst the gaiety of a wedding feast. A soft knock at the door preceded the entry of Gwen, her maid, bearing the morning tea tray. The rattle of the porcelain was a little more pronounced than usual, a sure sign that news, and not just breakfast, was being served. "A dreadful business at the manor," Gwen began, her voice a conspiratorial whisper as she set the tray down with a carefully controlled clink. Her eyes, bright with the morbid excitement that so often accompanies disaster in a quiet village, were fixed on her employer. "The whole village is buzzing. They say poor Mrs. Sophia, well, it was coming to her, in a manner of speaking." Miss Marple paused, her needle still. She removed her spectacles and began polishing them with a small chamois cloth, a gesture that invariably signified a shift from quiet contemplation to active inquiry. "Is that what they are saying, Gwen?" she asked, her voice mild. "And what reason do they give for such an unkind sentiment?" Gwen leaned forward, her duty to pour the tea momentarily forgotten. "It's the money. My cousin Elsie, you'll remember, was an under-parlourmaid there 2 years back, before she went to London. Elsie always said the old lady kept the purse strings pulled so tight you couldn't have slipped a threepenny bit through them. Mr. Thomas was forever asking for an advance on his inheritance to invest in some scheme or other, and she'd refuse him flat. A grown man, treated like a schoolboy." She poured the tea, a splash of milk clouding the dark amber liquid. "And as for his wife, Mrs. Clara, Elsie said she was, well, not quite right. Prone to hysterics, if you take my meaning. She'd have these terrible rows with the old lady, right there in the drawing-room. But whenever Mrs. Sophia threatened to have her seen to buy a doctor, everyone just tut-tutted and said the old dear was getting fanciful in her age." Miss Marple took a delicate sip of her tea. "How very curious," she murmured, more to herself than to Gwen. "It is so often the case, is it not? The person speaking an inconvenient truth is labelled as difficult, whilst everyone rallies around the one causing the trouble. It is a pattern one sees time and again." Her words hung in the air, laden with a significance that Gwen, already turning towards the door, did not fully grasp. Before the maid could depart, however, another knock sounded, this one sharper, more imperative. It was followed by the immediate entrance of Mrs. Price, a neighbour whose talent for gathering and disseminating village news was unparalleled. She swept in, a formidable figure in tweed, untying the scarf from under her chin as if preparing for a lengthy pronouncement. "Jane, my dear, you'll never credit it," she boomed, sinking into the armchair opposite Miss Marple without invitation. "I've just come from the baker's, and the things one hears. That family at the manor, an absolute nest of vipers." Miss Marple offered a faint, welcoming smile. "Do have a cup of tea, Beryl. You were a frequent visitor at Ashford, were you not? You knew Sophia well." "As well as anyone could," Mrs. Price declared, accepting the cup. "And let me tell you, the poor woman was besieged in her own home. She confided in me, you know, only a month ago. She held the money, yes, but for their own good. The eldest grandson, Michael, entirely absorbed in that new wife of his. And the younger boy, Harry, downright insolent. As for the girl, Emily, quiet as a mouse, but the sly sort of quiet, if you ask me. Always watching." She took a large gulp of tea and leaned closer, her voice dropping dramatically. "And this is the thing, Jane. Sophia told me money was going missing. Not large sums, mind you. That's what was so peculiar. A 10-shilling note from her purse here, a sovereign from the bureau there. Petty, irritating thefts. She was quite distressed about it. Said it was like being nibbled to death by ducks." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had resumed their gentle rhythm, paused once more. A tiny, thoughtful frown creased her brow. The two accounts she had just heard did not quite align. On the one hand, a son desperate for large sums of money. On the other, a matriarch vexed by the disappearance of pocket money. It was a discrepancy, a small, snagged thread in the fabric of the case. So, Miss Marple mused aloud, her gaze distant, it was not merely a case of a son being denied his inheritance. "Oh, that too." Mrs. Price waved her hand dismissively. "But this was different. More personal. It wore her down. She said to me, Beryl, there is a wickedness in this house, and I cannot put my finger on it. Her very words. A silence descended upon the little drawing-room, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Mrs. Price had delivered her news and now sat back, satisfied. Gwen hovered by the door, absorbing every word. But Miss Marple's mind was already far away, back in the glittering, shadowed drawing-room of Ashford Manor. The murder, she now felt with a growing certainty, was not a simple, brutal act born of a single motive like greed. It was the culmination of something else. It was the result of countless small resentments, of hidden jealousies and secret transgressions, all festering under one roof. Like the slow, creeping rot that can destroy the strongest beam in a house, the poison in that family had been at work long before a single drop was ever administered. The problem was not one grand grievance, but a tapestry of tiny, spiteful tears. And for Miss Marple, the task was no longer simply to identify a murderer, it was to unravel the tangled, bitter history of an entire household. Chapter 4: An Occasion for Grief. For days after the murder, the village of St. Mary Mead gathered to bury Sophia. The ancient church, with its cool stone walls and scent of beeswax and damp hymn books, was fuller than it had been for years. The air outside was heavy and still, the sky a blanket of uniform grey. The funeral bell tolled with a slow, mournful cadence, each note seeming to measure out the weight of the occasion. From a discreet pew at the back, Miss Marple observed the arrival of the family from Ashford Manor. They filed into the front row, a tableau of formal grief, each member seemingly isolated in their own private sorrow. Thomas's face was a mask of rigid control, his eyes red-rimmed but dry, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. He seemed a man holding himself together by sheer force of will. Beside him, Clara was the very picture of a bereaved daughter-in-law, her face pale beneath a delicate black veil. Yet, as she adjusted the veil, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a fleeting, unguarded expression, a quick, assessing glance around the church, a flicker of something in her eyes that was not grief but a sharp, restless calculation. Throughout the service, her hands, clad in tight black gloves, were never still. She smoothed them, wrung them, and picked at the seams, a constant, telltale motion of profound inner turmoil. Michael and his new bride, Martha, sat side by side, their hands tightly clasped. The shared joy of their wedding day had been utterly eclipsed, replaced by a dark, weary sorrow that made them look years older. They seemed to draw strength from each other, but it was the desperate strength of two people adrift in a storm. Further down the pew sat the younger two. Harry fidgeted ceaselessly with the collar of his coat, his body taut with a nervous energy that was entirely at odds with the solemnity of the service. He did not seem grief-stricken so much as cornered. And Emily, clutching a small, worn leather handbag on her lap, remained unnervingly still. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the bag. It was an odd accessory for a funeral, an object one brings for a purpose. The way the girl held it, not casually, but with a tense, protective grip, pricked at Miss Marple's curiosity. It was a small, discordant note in the symphony of mourning. To Miss Marple, who understood that human nature is most revealing under strain, the funeral was not merely a sad ceremony. It was a stage upon which the truth, however well hidden, was apt to betray itself in the smallest of gestures. After the service concluded and the mourners began to disperse into the damp churchyard, Inspector Graves made his way directly towards her. His face was as stern as ever, but the irritation with which he had first regarded her was gone, replaced by a deep, troubled gravity. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "A word with you, if I may. Away from the others." He led her to the ancient stone wall bordering the churchyard, where the yew trees stood as silent, thousand-year-old witnesses. "The post-mortem report came in this morning," he began without preamble, opening a small folder. "It has complicated matters considerably. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her gaze calm and attentive. "Oh." The inspector drew a deep breath. The knife wound to the throat was the final cause of death, yes. But it wasn't the whole story. The pathologist found significant traces of arsenic in her system. Not a single large dose, but smaller amounts, administered consistently over a period of weeks. She was being slowly poisoned. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression thoughtful but unsurprised. "I see. Well now, that does clarify one thing, does it not? The theory of a chance intruder is now quite untenable. One cannot imagine a common burglar stopping by to administer poison every few days." "Quite," Graves agreed, a grin set to his jaw. "It was someone in that house. Someone with daily access to her food or drink. But the question that follows is the most interesting one, Inspector," Miss Marple continued in her gentle, precise tone. "Poisoning, you see, is the weapon of a certain type of person. It requires patience, foresight, and a cold, calculating nature. One must watch and wait as one's victim slowly weakens. But to then take a knife and deliver such a violent, final blow, that speaks to an entirely different personality. That is the act of someone impulsive, someone driven by a sudden, uncontrollable surge of anger or panic." Inspector Graves stared at her, the implication of her words dawning on his face. "You mean to say, you think two people might be involved?" Miss Marple gave a faint, sad smile, her gaze drifting towards the family, now clustered together by the open grave. "I am not saying anything for certain, Inspector. I am only observing that the methods are very much at odds. It is as if one person loaded the gun, and another, perhaps unexpectedly, pulled the trigger." The inspector looked from Miss Marple to the grieving family and back again. The case had just split open, revealing a new and far more monstrous depth. He was no longer hunting for a single killer. He was now faced with the chilling possibility of a conspiracy born of two distinct evils, one patient and cold, the other impulsive and hot-blooded, both living under the same roof. The dark secrets of Ashford Manor, he realized, were only just beginning to surface. Chapter 5: Within the Walls. After the funeral, a heavy, suffocating stillness descended upon Ashford Manor. The light and bustle of the wedding day were now a ghostly memory, banished by the drawn velvet curtains that shut out the afternoon sun. Inside the great drawing-room, the air was cold and stale, thick with the unexpressed grief and rampant suspicion of a family locked in with its own secrets. Inspector Graves sat at the writing desk he had commandeered, a small pool of lamplight illuminating the papers spread before him. His face was etched with fatigue and frustration as he sought to impose logical order upon a crime of illogical passions. It was into this silence that Miss Marple entered, her soft-soled shoes making almost no sound on the thick Persian carpet. "Inspector," she said gently, causing him to look up with a start. "I fancy the answers we seek will not be found in paperwork alone. A house like this, it holds its own memories. One only needs to know how to listen." Graves ran a hand through his hair, his professional mask slipping to reveal his weariness. "I have a perfectly workable theory, Miss Marple. The daughter-in-law, Clara. Her maid's gossip confirmed she was emotionally unstable, prone to hysterics. Her behavior at the funeral was agitated. She had the opportunity. An unstable woman, pushed too far, could be capable of both the poisoning and the final, frantic attack. It was a tidy explanation, one that would close the case. Miss Marple seated herself, her gaze thoughtful. "Inspector, simple things are so often the most deceptive. To administer poison over a period of weeks requires a great deal of patience and quiet cunning. "Has Mrs. Thomas ever struck you as a patient woman?" she asked mildly. "Her nature is impulsive. An impulsive woman might throw a vase or create a scene. She might even, in a fit of temper, strike a single, terrible blow. But to play the long, slow, secret game of the poisoner? It does not seem to be in her character. It is, if you will forgive the analogy, like asking a terrier to behave like a cat." Her words, spoken with such calm certainty, seemed to dismantle his theory piece by piece. As the inspector frowned, a flicker of movement at the far end of the room caught Miss Marple's eye. It was Emily, slipping past the doorway. She moved quickly, almost furtively, casting a nervous glance back into the room as if fearful of being seen. Her hands were clenched at her sides, and her entire posture was one of coiled, secret fear. Lowering her voice, Miss Marple turned back to the inspector. "That child is very frightened," she murmured. "I believe, Inspector, that if you wish to understand the illness in this house, you must look in the nursery, so to speak. I think it would be wise to search the children's rooms." The inspector considered this for a moment, his gaze following the path Emily had taken. He gave a sharp nod. "Very well. A constable will accompany you. We'll start with the girl's room." Emily's room was a small chamber, its walls adorned with cheerful posters of ponies and film stars, a pathetic attempt at girlish normality. A constable began a methodical search, opening drawers with impersonal efficiency. The first drawer contained a jumble of scarves and ribbons, but underneath them, a small tin box. Inside was a collection of coins and small notes, hoarded away like a magpie's treasure. In the back of another drawer, they found several slips of paper, partially burnt, their blackened edges crumbling at the touch. The writing was illegible, secrets turned to ash. The most curious find came from a jewelry box on the dressing table. Tucked beneath a velvet lining was a small, silver locket on a delicate chain. Miss Marple took it in her gloved hand and pressed the catch. It sprang open to reveal a tiny, faded photograph of a much younger Sophia, her face proud and clear. The air in the small room grew thick with unspoken questions. Was it a keepsake, a trophy, or something else entirely? Just as the inspector was making a note, the door was flung open and Thomas stood there, his face a thunderous mask of outrage. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice shaking with fury. "My mother has been murdered, and you see fit to remedy the situation by tearing apart my daughter's bedroom? This is an intolerable violation." "It is a necessary part of our investigation, sir," Graves replied, his tone cold and official. "I will not have it." Thomas's voice rose. "You will not treat my family like common criminals. If you wish to search this house, you will return with a court order. Until then, you have no right. Now, get out of this room." The inspector drew a deep breath, his jaw tight. He was thwarted. For now, Thomas was correct. He closed his notebook with a sharp snap. "As you wish, sir." Miss Marple had remained silent throughout the confrontation, but her eyes held a familiar, discerning light. As they retreated from the room, she paused beside the inspector in the hall. "A setback, Inspector, but not a defeat," she said quietly. "While you arrange for the necessary paperwork, might I suggest 2 other avenues of inquiry? You must speak to this family solicitor and to their doctor. The solicitor knows the truth of their finances, and the doctor knows the truth of their health, both physical and mental. Between those two, you will find a great deal that the family itself will not tell you." She paused, adding as if it were an afterthought, "And yes, perhaps a quiet word at the schools young Harry and Emily attend might prove fruitful. A child's world, you know, often reflects the secrets of its home." The inspector looked at her, his earlier frustration giving way to a grudging admiration. The old woman's mind, he was beginning to realize, moved several steps ahead of his own. While he had been stopped by a wall, she had already pointed out 3 new doors. Chapter 6: The Doctor, the Lawyer, and the School Report. 3 days later, a languid summer stillness had settled over St. Mary Mead. In Miss Marple's small cottage, the air was warm and smelled faintly of lavender and beeswax. A lone bee buzzed drowsily against the window pane, and steam rose in a delicate spiral from the teacup placed beside her armchair. The scene was one of perfect, domestic peace. Yet the knitting that lay untouched in Miss Marple's lap was a testament to a mind preoccupied with a darkness that was anything but peaceful. A sharp knock at the door announced the arrival of Inspector Graves. When Gwen showed him in, he looked profoundly tired, the skin around his eyes drawn and shadowed as though he had not slept. In his hand, he carried a thick file of papers, which he placed upon the small table with the weary air of a man burdened by too many facts and not enough truth. "Ah, Inspector," Miss Marple said with a gentle smile. "Do come in. I expect you have been very busy." "That's one word for it, Miss Marple," he sighed, sinking into the chair she indicated. He gratefully accepted a cup of tea. "I followed your lines of inquiry, and I must admit, they have borne fruit. Strange fruit, but fruit nonetheless." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her expression one of quiet anticipation. "Please, Inspector." "I am listening most carefully." The inspector opened the first folder. "I spoke with Mr. Collins, the family solicitor." A dry old bird, but precise. "The will is straightforward. Upon Mrs. Sophia's death, the entire estate, including the manor, passes to her son, Thomas." He paused for effect. However, there was a rather stringent clause. While she was alive, any significant capital could only be released with her express written approval. Collins confirmed that just 3 weeks ago, Thomas made a formal request for a substantial sum for some business venture. She refused him point blank. He looked at Miss Marple, expecting this to be a revelation. "So, Thomas had a clear and immediate motive," she murmured, her gaze steady. "But having a reason to wish someone gone and taking the necessary steps to make it so are 2 very different things, are they not? Motive provides the desire, but murder requires a certain quality of character." Graves conceded the point with a nod and picked up the second paper. "Next, the doctor. He confirmed your assessment of Mrs. Clara's temperament entirely. He described her as highly strung and emotionally volatile. He has been prescribing her sedatives for years." Graves looked down at his notes. But he was adamant on one point. In his professional opinion, she lacks the methodical temperament for a long-term poisoning plot. He said, and I quote, "Mrs. Clara lives entirely in the moment. She is incapable of planning for next week, let alone plotting a murder over several." "Just as one supposed," Miss Marple said softly. "She is the terrier, not the cat. All bark and immediate bite, but no silent, patient stalking." The inspector placed the second paper aside and picked up the third file. This time, his expression was not just weary, but deeply perplexed. "And now for the strangest part of all," he said, his voice heavier. "We made inquiries at the children's schools. The reports are disturbing. The headmaster at Harry's boarding school noted that for the past few months, the boy has been unusually generous, treating his friends to sweets, cinema tickets, all manner of things. Nothing extravagant, but a constant drain of pocket money he shouldn't have had. He opened the file further. But the report from Emily's finishing school is even more astonishing. Her housemistress reports that Emily has been giving gifts to her classmates. Not just trinkets, Miss Marple. Silk ribbons, bottles of French perfume, even small pieces of silver jewelry. When the mistress, suspecting the items might be stolen, questioned her, Emily apparently smiled sweetly and said, "Oh no, miss. Grandmother gives me the money. She likes me to be popular." For a long moment, Miss Marple's hands, which had been resting on her knitting, became perfectly still. Her eyes, behind the thick lenses of her glasses, grew sharp and bright. "Interesting," she breathed, the word barely a whisper. "Very interesting indeed." The inspector leaned forward, the weight of the contradiction pressing on him. "But that's the whole point, isn't it? It's a complete lie. We know for a fact that Sophia was tightening the purse strings. She refused her own son a business loan that could have secured his future. Why on earth would she be handing over sovereigns to her 16-year-old granddaughter to buy perfume and trinkets? It makes no sense at all." A deep silence filled the sunlit room, broken only by the steady ticking of the mantel clock. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her mind working behind a placid facade. All the disparate threads were now in her hands, a son desperate for a fortune, a daughter-in-law of volatile temper, and two children suddenly and inexplicably flush with cash and expensive trifles. She looked calmly at the inspector. "Tomorrow morning, you must summon the entire family to the drawing-room at Ashford Manor," she said, her voice gentle but infused with a new authority. "The things you have discovered are not contradictions, Inspector. They are directions. They point to the truth, and that truth is waiting for us within those very walls." The inspector nodded, his face still clouded with confusion, but a glimmer of new determination sparked in his tired eyes. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, her needles clicking together with a soft, rhythmic purpose. It was the sound of a pattern, long tangled, finally being set to rights. Chapter 7: The Summing Up. The next morning, the great drawing-room of Ashford Manor was once again the stage for a grim drama. The family was assembled, seated stiffly in their chairs, a captive audience awaiting a verdict. The heavy curtains remained drawn against the morning light, and the air within was thick with a silent, simmering dread. Inspector Graves stood by the mantelpiece, grim and official, while his constables were positioned discreetly by the door. It was Miss Marple who broke the suffocating silence. She sat in her usual corner, her knitting resting in her lap, her gaze traveling from one family member to another, not with accusation, but with a profound and gentle sorrow. "We have been looking at this sad affair as a single crime," she began, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room. "But I believe that is where the difficulty has lain. We are not, you see, looking for one person. We are looking for two very different personalities. One, a person of patience and cunning, who was willing to wait. And another, a person of impulse and temper, who acted in a moment of panic." A rustle of unease passed through the family. Thomas stared at her blankly, while Clara clutched the arms of her chair. "Let us first consider the poison," Miss Marple continued calmly. "The slow, methodical poisoning of Mrs. Sophia. This was the work of someone who saw her every day, who could tend to her needs. It was also, I believe, connected to the small, persistent thefts that Mrs. Price spoke of. The pilfering of shillings and sovereigns, the source of which so distressed the poor lady." Her eyes rested on Emily. A young girl at a fine school wishes for pretty things, ribbons, perfumes, trinkets to win the favor of her friends. When her grandmother, who holds the family purse strings so tightly, would not provide them, she began to help herself. Small amounts at first. But the habit grew. Inspector Graves stepped forward. During our search this morning, authorized by a warrant, we found these items in Miss Emily's dressing table. A constable brought forward a tray. On it lay several small bottles. Sedatives, the inspector said grimly. Prescribed for Mrs. Clara, but found in her daughter's room. Easily administered in a cup of tea. He then uncovered a second item on the tray, a small box containing an assortment of jewelry, a silver locket, a pearl brooch, a pair of garnet earrings. Thomas let out a choked gasp. That's Mother's. I recognize that brooch. They were stolen from her room weeks ago. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. So the one who administered the sedatives, weakening the old lady day by day, and the one who stole her jewelry, it was you, was it not, my dear Emily? The girl's face was a mask of white terror. Her lips trembled, and she clutched the worn leather bag in her lap as if it were a shield. But that, Miss Marple went on, does not account for the final, brutal act. The poison was working too slowly. Something happened that evening. A crisis. The thefts, I imagine, were discovered. Her gaze shifted to Harry. That is where the second personality comes in. The impulsive one, quick to anger, terrified of exposure. You told us, Harry, that you were in the kitchen when the lights went out. And so you were. Not to arrange food, but to fetch this. The inspector produced a second item, holding it carefully in a handkerchief. It was the knife from the kitchen block, its blade tarnished with a faint, dark stain. We found this hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Mr. Harry's wardrobe, he stated. Harry's face, which had been ashen, now flushed a dark, mottled red. He half rose from his chair, his eyes wide with a trapped fury. It was Clara who finally broke. No, she shrieked, her voice shrill with hysteria. It's a lie. You are twisting things. My children are innocent. You are trying to blame them. Miss Marple looked at her, and for the first time, her voice held a sliver of steel. Innocent, Clara? Your children, who were reported by their schools for spending money they could not possibly have. For giving away gifts they could not afford? Where did it all come from? Not from Sophia, who would not even give her own son the funds he needed. The evidence speaks for itself. Your children were stealing from their grandmother. And on the night of the wedding, she confronted them. She saw through their lies, and she was going to expose them. Her voice dropped, filled with the weight of the tragedy. And so, in a moment of panic, they silenced her forever. The room fell into a dead, ringing silence. Clara collapsed back into her chair, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with dry, tearing sobs. Emily sat frozen, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Harry stood trembling, his face a battleground of rage, shame, and despair. The inspector gave a quiet, almost imperceptible signal. The two constables detached themselves from the wall and moved to stand, one on either side of Harry and Emily. The motive was not a grand inheritance, Miss Marple said softly, as if to herself. It began with the smallest of sins. With greed, and envy, and the secret, festering pride of youth. Sophia was killed in her own house, by her own blood. A cold draught seemed to sweep through the room, though no window was open, as if the very walls of Ashford Manor shuddered at the truth that had finally been brought into the light. Chapter 8. The Truth. The drawing-room of Ashford Manor was silent, but it was a silence thick with the echoes of Miss Marple's final, dreadful words. The truth, now laid bare, seemed to suck the very air from the room, leaving the family stranded in a vacuum of horror. Harry and Emily stood flanked by the constables, two children suddenly aged by the weight of their crimes. Inspector Graves laid the files he was holding on the table, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. His voice, when he spoke, was hard and official, stripped of all emotion. "Harry, Emily, you have heard the evidence. Do you wish to say anything?" The room held its breath. It was Emily who broke first. Her quiet composure, the mask she had worn for so long, finally crumbled. Her face crumpled like a child's, and her confession came in a torrent of gasping, hiccuping sobs. I only wanted pretty things," she whispered, her voice trembling and weak. "At school, the other girls had such lovely things. I used to put just a little of Mummy's medicine in Grandmother's tea in the afternoons. Just enough to make her drowsy. When she was asleep in her chair, I would take a note or two from her purse. It was a game. I didn't mean. I never meant for her to be hurt. I just wanted the money for ribbons and perfumes." Her voice trailed off into a pathetic whimper, the tears streaming down her pale cheeks. She seemed to be mourning not her grandmother, but the loss of her childish, selfish game. A terrible sound, half-gasp, half-groan, was torn from Thomas's throat. He slumped in his chair as if his very bones had dissolved. Then Harry's voice ripped through the room, not with remorse, but with a final, desperate roar of anger and grief. He straightened up, his eyes squeezed shut as if to block out the sight of his ruined life. "She was going to tell everyone," he shouted, his voice cracking with adolescent rage. "That afternoon, she found Emily's box of jewelry. She called us thieves. Vipers. She said she was going to call the police after the wedding guests had gone. She was going to ruin us. It was Emily's idea. When the lights flickered, she said, 'Now,' and went to the main switch in the hall. It was our only chance. In the dark. I took the knife. I thought if she was just quiet, everything would be all right again. If she hadn't threatened us, it never would have happened." His words, a terrible confession and a pathetic justification all in one, hung in the air like poison. A dreadful, hysterical sob broke from Clara, who rocked back and forth in her chair, a mother utterly destroyed by the truth of her own children. Michael had his head in his hands, while his new wife, Martha, wept silently beside him, her wedding and her new life forever stained by this horror. Inspector Graves gave a curt nod to the constables. They moved forward, placing firm hands on the shoulders of the brother and sister. As they were led from the room, their faces were a study in contrast, Emily's, a mask of tear-streaked, uncomprehending remorse, Harry's, a turbulent storm of restless, unrepentant fury. The heavy oak door closed behind them, and the room was left with nothing but the loud, relentless ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Each second fell like a hammer blow on the shattered remnants of the family. Miss Marple finally stirred. Her gaze, filled with a profound, weary pity, rested on the broken figures of Thomas and Clara. "It was not the money, in the end," she said softly, her voice the only sound besides the clock and the weeping. "Sophia was murdered in her own home, by her own blood, because the small lies were about to be exposed. Greed is a seed, and in the fertile ground of a secret, it will grow into a monstrous tree. This tragedy did not begin with a knife in the dark. It began long ago, with a 10-shilling note taken from a purse, with a child's envy left unchecked. When the truth is buried in a family, Inspector, it does not die. It festers. And one day, it will always emerge as murder. She rose slowly from her chair and adjusted her soft grey shawl. There was no hint of triumph in her expression, only a deep and abiding sorrow for the frailties and wickedness of the human heart. Her work here was done. The truth was out, a terrible and cleansing fire, and she was a visitor from a simpler, saner world. Ashford Manor, she knew, would forever stand as a silent, hollow monument to the family it had destroyed from within.